What's up, moviegoers? Welcome to the Markio Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony. In today's episode of the Markio Podcast, I'm talking about the 1996 slasher movie, Scream, directed by Wes Craven, written by Kevin Williamson, and starring David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, Matthew Lillard, Rose McGowan, Skeet Ulrich, and Drew Barrymore. Now, the movie tells the story of the character Sidney Prescott, a high school student in the fictional town of Woodsboro, California, who becomes the target of a mysterious killer in a Halloween costume known as Ghostface. Scream combines the whodunit mystery along with the horror aspect of things and the horror cliches that were popularized in Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, the reason Scream was very successful, it was because it was considered unique at the time of its release for featuring characters who were aware of the real-world horror films and openly discussing the cliches about them, and as the way to try to, attempt to subvert them or, get away with things. Now, this movie received a cult status once it was released, and you could say that Scream was credited with revitalizing the horror movie genre in the 1990s, because every horror movie that was released in the 1990s was basically a direct-to-video release, and the numerous sequels that these direct-to-video releases had, especially from the 1970s and the 80s. And these sequels drew decreasing financial and critical success, but they also exploited the cliches upon films of this genre. Now, Scream did spawn 3 more sequels after this one: Scream 2, Scream 3, and Scream 4. The movie was a big hit, and it was a commercial success. Now, the interesting factor is that this movie started off in a way where you have a main character played by Drew Barrymore, and it's like the scene in Psycho. Janet Leigh at the time was a big popular actress, and she dies within the first 30 minutes to 45 minutes in the opening scene. Here's the thing. The same fate happens to Drew Barrymore. You think Drew Barrymore is the main character, and she's not. She's killed off in this movie right at the start of the beginning. Now, the interesting factor about this movie was that it was released in December of 1996, just a few days before Christmas. It has a running time of 111 minutes. The budget was $15 million, and it grossed $173 million at the box office. So a movie like this, that was a horror genre movie directed by Wes Craven, released during the time of Christmas, was, a bit iffy, but I guess not, because it made its money and it gained a cult following. Now, each character in this movie has its own unique role. David Arquette is great. Neve Campbell definitely stands out as Sidney Prescott, and Courtney Cox is also great as the reporter Gale Weathers. Now, the other interesting thing about this movie is that Jamie Kennedy, who plays Randy Meeks, is one of those so-called horror movie buffs. And, he says, never say you'll be back or you'll never be back, or, don't go out somewhere alone and you're going to die, some this and that. And there's a lot of interesting ways that certain people die in this movie, It's very different. And at the end, we find out the twist that there's more than one killer. It's surprising how they did that. And the whole use of the whole blood thing and the corn syrup, and it's just over the top weird and wow. Now, the voice of Ghostface is played by Roger Jackson, and let me just say that the voice is so creepy and eerie. And once you hear that, phone call, it's like, do you like scary movies and stuff like that? It just gets your, shivers down your spine. Wes Craven makes a cameo appearance as Fred the Janitor, who is a reference to Freddy Krueger character from The Nightmare on Elm Street. And Linda Blair from The Exorcist is a news reporter, and she has a cameo role as well. And it's very interesting to see that these, like Wes Craven, Linda Blair show up, and Henry Winkler is actually in this too. He plays Principal Arthur Himbry, and it's just great to see. Liev Schreiber, who was an underrated actor and still is an underrated actor, plays Cotton Weary, so-called, the one who escapes all these murders. So basically, this movie was created because Kevin Williamson, the writer, loved his appreciation, and he's such a huge horror fan, and it became evident in the script, and he was inspired by, movies and references to Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, When a Stranger Calls, and the underrated horror movie Prom Night. So by June of 1995, Williamson brought the Scary Movie script to agent Rob Paris to put out for sale. Now, the Paris thought that, with such level of violence and gore, that this script would be impossible to sell. And following the script's purchase by Miramax, Williamson was required to remove much of the gory content, such as graphic depictions of organs falling out and this. However, once Wes Craven got a hold of it and was secured as director, he was able to bring back much of those, gory scenes that were cut in the movie. Of course, when you get Wes Craven directing your movie that you just wrote, of course you're going to be able to put all those things back. And as for the fact, like I said, they were two killers, and Williamson decided to do both. The character of Billy Loomis had the motivation of the maternal abandonment, while the second serial killer, Stu, jokingly suggests that peer pressure was his motive because Billy told him to do so. Now, if you didn't know, Billy Loomis, the character name, is a play on the character of Dr. Sam Loomis from Halloween. No relation at all, and it's just its own standalone thing in the movie. And for kids growing up in the 90s, this was one of those horror movies where you see for the first time, it's like, holy shit, this is what I grew up on. This is the horror movies I grew up on. I grew up in the 90s, and when I saw this for the first time, I was blown away by it. And I'm pretty sure if you're one of those kids who grew up in the 90s, you didn't know anything about the references to the Halloween movies, Friday the 13th, or Wes Craven's own Nightmare on Elm Street. And not many of you knew who Wes Craven was. So when Wes Craven comes back to the horror genre and makes Scream, you know it's going to be a good movie, and you know for a fact it's going to be fantastic. And this is what that was. The movie, garnered and made fun of the previous movies of the horror genre, but it brought it back in a way, and it upped the notch to a whole new level. The more so that when this movie came out, female viewership was higher than male viewership. So a lot of women were going to see this movie instead of males. And, when this movie became a cult hit, people at the time, not around, 1997, I want to say that, Halloween of 1997, people were wearing the Ghostface costume and makeup and, doing different looks about it. It was astronomical. And you couldn't even, look around the corner and you see Ghostface coming at you. So what Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson created was a masterpiece in the horror genre. Just by naming the movie Scream and making fun and, of the cliches from the original old horror movies from the 1970s and 80s and bringing it back in the 90s, it was great. It was done right. It was done fantastically well. And it made money. And you get young actors like, David Arquette, Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, Matthew Lillard, Drew Barrymore, who's a big name at the time, to appear in a movie like this. You realize, wow, something is up and something is really happening here. I enjoyed this movie for what it is, and anytime it's on, it's great. Like I said, other than the gore factor, which is, to me, I think it's over the top, but it works in a movie like this, and I feel bad for the people who were, in that red food dye and that corn syrup and just, being sticky. You could tell the scene was a little bit sticky and messy. But for 1996 and coming out a few days before Christmas on December 20th, 1996, this movie was really, really garnered a following that is unprecedented to this day. And it's fantastic to see because, it established its own, criteria of what a horror movie should be. You had movies from the 1970s and 1980s that were horror movies that followed a certain path. It was a killer, it was a serial killer, that was it. But then Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson took that and brought it into the 90s, and then from here on out, horror genre and horror aspect of how things are done changed. Horror movies today actually give callbacks to old horror movies from the 1940s up until the 1880s, and you see that, and they pay homage to that, which is very good. If you're a filmmaker like myself and a film critic like myself, you see all those similarities and the callbacks and the homages that they happen, and you really appreciate that from filmmakers, and Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson definitely did that, and it was really, really good to see, especially in a movie like Scream. So I know many of you listeners out there have seen Scream, and now let me know in the comment section below what you thought about it and if you think it changed the horror genre as we know it. And did you notice the similarities and horror cliches that they talked about in the movie with Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Wes Craven's own Nightmare on Elm Street? I'm really curious to hear your answers. So let me know in the comment section below. And be sure you click that subscribe button and hit that notification bell for new videos and new podcast episodes on the Markio Productions YouTube page. And follow Markio Productions on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And follow me, Anthony, your host, on Instagram and Twitter at Mr. Filmstock. And follow the Markio Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'll leave a link to all the social media accounts in the description box below. You can check it out and follow along. All right, everyone, that does it for today's episode. I'm your host, Anthony. Thanks for tuning in.
Why do you want to know my name?
I want to know who I'm looking at.
What did you say?